The dust rose in clouds thick enough to choke a man, as Tessa Jamison cracked her whip above the heads of 2,000 longhorns, her voice carrying across the Texas plains with a force that made seasoned cowboys straighten in their saddles. It was April 1878, and she had inherited more than just cattle when her father died. 6 months prior, she had inherited his reputation, his debts, and a cattle drive that would either save the ranch or destroy everything the Jamison family had built over 3 generations. The men who worked for her father had scattered like tumbleweeds after the funeral, unwilling to take orders from a 22-year-old woman, no matter how capable she proved herself to be on horseback or with a rope. Now she stood in the hiring yard of San Antonio with 5 hired hands who looked more interested in the whiskey waiting for them in town than the grueling 2-month drive north to the railhead in Dodge City, Kansas. Tessa adjusted her hat, a battered Stetson that had belonged to her father, and surveyed the men before her with eyes the color of prairie grass after rain. She wore practical clothing, canvas trousers, a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen more miles than most men twice her age. Her dark auburn hair was braided and pinned beneath the hat, though wisps escaped to curl against her sun-bronzed neck. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5'9", with the lean muscle of someone who had spent their entire life working cattle rather than sitting in drawing rooms learning needlepoint. "Listen up," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This drive leaves at dawn tomorrow. We have 2,000 head to move nearly 800 miles. I expect every man to pull his weight, follow orders without question, and keep the herd moving no matter what weather or trouble we encounter. You will be paid when we reach Dodge City and the cattle are sold, not before. If any man has a problem taking orders from me, speak now and collect whatever wages you are owed for the days you have worked preparing for this drive." The 5 men exchanged glances. 4 of them were young, barely old enough to shave, hired because they were cheap and desperate for work. The 5th was an older man named Red Carlson, weathered and bowlegged, who had worked cattle drives for 30 years, and claimed he did not care who gave orders as long as the pay was good. Tessa suspected he had stayed because nobody else would hire a man who drank as much as Red did, but she needed every hand she could get. Nobody spoke up. Nobody walked away. "Good," Tessa said. "Get some rest. We move out at first light." She turned and walked toward the small office where she had been conducting business, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. Behind her, she heard the men muttering among themselves, but she did not look back. She had learned from her father that showing doubt or hesitation was the fastest way to lose respect, especially when that respect was already hanging by a thread. Inside the cramped office, Tessa spread the route map across the scarred wooden desk and traced the trail north with one calloused finger. San Antonio to Austin, then north through Waco, across the Red River into Indian Territory, and finally into Kansas. 800 miles of rivers to cross, storms to weather, and countless things that could go wrong. She needed at least 10 experienced men for a herd this size, but she had 5 inexperienced boys and 1 drunk. It would have to be enough. A knock at the door made her look up. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun so that she could not make out his features clearly at first. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the easy stance of someone comfortable in their own skin. As he stepped inside and removed his hat, Tessa saw a face that was all hard angles and sun-weathered lines, with eyes the color of whiskey and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He looked to be about 26 or 27, old enough to have experience but young enough to still have the strength for hard work. "Madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the small space. "Name is Graham Irwin. I heard you are short-handed for a drive north, and I am looking for work." Tessa straightened, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who had been evaluating men and livestock her entire life. His clothes were worn but clean. His boots were good quality though they showed hard use, and his hands bore the calluses and rope burns of a working cowboy. The gun on his hip was well maintained but not flashy, the mark of a practical man rather than a gunfighter looking for glory. "You have experience on cattle drives?" she asked. 10 years, Graham said. "Started as a wrangler when I was 16, worked my way up to point rider on drives from Texas to Montana. I know the trails, I know cattle, and I can handle myself in most situations that might arise." "Why are you looking for work this late in the season? Most outfits hired their crews weeks ago." Graham's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The outfit I was supposed to ride with fell through. The trail boss took sick, and his sons decided to sell the herd locally rather than risk the drive. By the time I found out, most other crews had already left." It was a plausible story, and Tessa wanted to believe it because she desperately needed experienced men, but she had also learned to be cautious. "I am paying standard wages, but only after the cattle are sold in Dodge City. And I will be trail boss. If you have any problem taking orders from a woman, we might as well part ways now." Graham met her gaze directly, and Tessa saw neither mockery nor condescension in his eyes. "Madam, I have ridden for good trail bosses and bad ones. The only thing I care about is whether someone knows what they are doing. Everything I have heard about how you have been running this operation tells me you do." Something in his tone, respectful but not obsequious, direct without being presumptuous, made Tessa's decision for her. "You are hired. We leave at dawn. Be here with your gear and a good horse." Graham settled his hat back on his head and tipped it slightly in acknowledgement. "Yes, madam, I will be here." After he left, Tessa returned to her map, but her mind kept wandering to the new hire. There had been something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that reminded her of her father in his prime. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She needed experienced hands, and Graham Irwin appeared to be exactly that. Whatever else she might have noticed about him, the strong line of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes was irrelevant to the task ahead. That night, Tessa barely slept. She lay in the boarding house bed, staring at the ceiling and mentally running through everything that could go wrong on the drive. Stampedes, river crossings, hostile Indians, rustlers, injuries, disease, storms, the list was endless. Her father had made this drive a dozen times, but he had also died of a heart attack at 53, worn out from decades of hard living. Sometimes Tessa wondered if the ranch was worth the sacrifice, if she should just sell everything and use the money to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere she would not constantly be fighting to prove herself. But then she thought of her mother, buried on a hillside overlooking the ranch house, and her father beside her now. She thought of the brand they had built, the J-Bar-J, and the land that bore the marks of their sweat and blood. Walking away would mean admitting that a woman could not do what a man could do, and Tessa Jamison would be damned before she gave anyone that satisfaction. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Tessa was already at the stockyards when the first of her hired hands arrived, checking tack and making sure the horses were sound. Red Carlson showed up next, his eyes bloodshot but his hands steady enough. The 4 young cowboys, Billy, Tom, Frank, and a kid who went by Lefty, arrived in a group, their faces still soft with sleep, but their excitement palpable. This was probably the first real cattle drive for any of them. Graham Irwin arrived last, riding a handsome bay gelding that looked like it had both speed and endurance. He led a pack horse loaded with neatly arranged gear, and Tessa noted with approval that everything was secured properly and showed signs of careful maintenance. A man who took care of his equipment generally took care in his work as well. "Morning," Graham said, dismounting with easy grace. "Where do you want me?" "We will sort out positions once we get the herd moving," Tessa said. "For now, help get these cattle pointed north. We have 800 miles ahead of us and not a day to waste." The next few hours were controlled chaos as they pushed the herd out of the stockyards and onto the trail. 2,000 longhorns were not inclined to move as one cohesive unit, especially at the start of a drive when they were still nervous and unpredictable. Tessa rode point, guiding the lead steers north while Graham and Red worked the flanks, keeping the middle of the herd from bunching up or spreading too wide. The 4 young cowboys rode drag, eating dust and pushing the stragglers along from the rear. By midday, they had covered nearly 10 miles, and the herd was beginning to settle into a rhythm. The longhorns walked in a loose column, their horns occasionally clacking together, their hooves raising a constant din that would become the soundtrack of the next 2 months. Tessa called a brief halt to let the cattle drink at a creek and to give the men a chance to grab some jerky and water. Graham rode up beside her as she sat on her horse watching the herd. "You have got them moving well," he said. "That could have been a lot rougher." "My father taught me that cattle are like people," Tessa said. "They will follow a leader if they trust that leader knows where they are going. The trick is establishing yourself as that leader from the start. Your father sounds like he was a smart man. He was." Tessa's voice carried a note of grief that she had not quite managed to bury. "He died last October. This was supposed to be his drive." Graham was quiet for a moment, then said, "I am sorry for your loss. Taking this on yourself cannot be easy." "No choice," Tessa said simply. "The ranch is mortgaged to the bank. If I do not get these cattle to market and pay off the debt, I lose everything. So easy or not, it has to be done." She urged her horse forward before Graham could respond, not wanting to show any more vulnerability than she already had. This was exactly the kind of weakness her father had warned against, letting emotions interfere with leadership. She needed to be hard, focused, untouchable. There would be time for grief and doubt after the cattle were sold and the ranch was saved. They made 15 miles that first day, which Tessa considered acceptable given that the herd was still getting accustomed to the routine. She had scouted campsites along the route beforehand, and they stopped for the night near a stream with good grass for grazing. While the cattle settled, Tessa assigned watch rotations. With only 6 of them, it meant everyone would pull multiple shifts each night, but there was no way around it. Graham volunteered for the midnight to 3 o'clock shift without being asked, which Tessa appreciated. Red took the first shift along with Billy, while Tom and Frank would take the 3 o'clock to dawn watch. That left Tessa with the 9 o'clock to midnight shift alongside Lefty, which would give her a few hours of sleep before and after. They made a simple camp bedrolls around a small fire, coffee boiling in a battered pot, and salt pork fried with beans for dinner. The young cowboys talked among themselves, excited and nervous, while Red sat apart drinking coffee that Tessa suspected had been liberally fortified with whiskey from his personal flask. Graham helped with the horses, checking hooves and removing saddles without being told, working with the efficient movements of someone who had done these tasks 10,000 times before. Tessa found herself watching him as she ate her meager dinner. He moved with a kind of unconscious grace that was unusual in such a large man, and he seemed to anticipate what needed doing without waiting for orders. When one of the pack horses started acting skittish, Graham was there immediately, calming the animal with a soft word and a steady hand. When the fire started to die, he added wood without being asked. Small things, but they added up to a picture of someone who was genuinely competent and willing to work. "You're staring," Red said quietly, settling down beside her with his cup of fortified coffee. Tessa jerked her attention away from Graham, feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am observing," she corrected, "making sure he is worth what I am paying him." Red made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Sure, that is what you were doing." "Shut up, Red," Tessa said without heat. The old cowboy grinned into his cup. "Your daddy always said you had your mama's stubbornness and his pride. Dangerous combination in a woman." "Dangerous combination in anyone," Tessa corrected. "And right now, that combination is the only thing keeping this drive moving, so maybe it is not such a bad thing." Red raised his cup in acknowledgement. "Fair enough, boss, fair enough." The first few days of the drive fell into a pattern. Up before dawn, get the herd moving, push them 15 to 20 miles depending on terrain and water availability. Make camp, pull watch shifts, sleep a few hours and do it all again. The weather stayed clear, which was a blessing, and the cattle seemed to accept their fate without too much trouble. The young cowboys were learning fast, though they made plenty of mistakes that Tessa or Graham or Red had to correct. Still, they were willing and they worked hard, which counted for a lot. Graham proved to be everything he had claimed and more. He could read cattle like some men read books, spotting potential trouble before it developed and moving to head it off. He had a gift for handling the horses and a steady hand with a rope. More than that, he followed Tessa's orders without question, but also had the confidence to make decisions on his own when circumstances required it. She found herself relying on him more and more, positioning him at key points in the herd where his experience could do the most good. What surprised Tessa was that Graham never once questioned her authority or made her feel like he thought he should be in charge. Some of the men her father had employed had always carried an undercurrent of resentment when taking orders from her, a sense that they were humoring the boss's daughter rather than respecting a legitimate authority. Graham treated her exactly the way he would treat any trail boss, with respect, professionalism, and the assumption that she knew what she was doing. It was refreshing. It was also, though Tessa tried not to acknowledge it, attractive. They crossed into Austin territory after 5 days, and Tessa decided to stop long enough to resupply and check the cattle for any injuries or illness that might have developed. The herd was holding up well, but this was still the easy part of the drive. The real challenges would come when they crossed into Indian territory and had to navigate unfamiliar ground with unpredictable threats. While the men took the opportunity to rest, and the younger cowboys slipped off to find whatever entertainment Austin had to offer, Tessa met with a local cattleman who had offered to buy 50 head on the spot. The price was lower than what she would get in Dodge City, but the immediate cash would help cover some of their expenses on the trail and give her a small cushion if anything went wrong later. She was in the middle of negotiating the price when Graham appeared at her elbow. "Madam, we have got a problem," he said quietly. Tessa excused herself and followed Graham outside where Red was waiting with a grim expression. "What is it?" she asked. "Tom and Lefty got into some trouble in town," Red said. "They are in jail. Sheriff says they started a fight at a saloon and busted up the place pretty good." Tessa closed her eyes and counted to 10, trying to control her temper. "How much is the damage?" "Sheriff says $50 will cover it and get them released," Graham said. "But that is probably twice what the actual damage was. He is taking advantage because he knows we cannot afford to leave them behind." $50 was a significant chunk of the emergency fund Tessa had set aside for exactly these kinds of situations. But Graham was right, she could not afford to lose two men, no matter how stupid they had been. "Fine," she said. "Pay it. And when those two idiots are released, tell them they are docked a month's wages, and if they pull anything like this again, they can walk back to Texas." Graham nodded and headed toward the sheriff's office. Tessa returned to her negotiation, but her mind was not fully on it anymore. This was exactly the kind of complication that could derail the entire drive if she let it spiral out of control. She needed to maintain discipline, but she also could not afford to lose any more men than she already had. By the time the cattle were sold, and Tom and Lefty were released from jail, both looking thoroughly ashamed of themselves, it was too late to move the herd out. They would camp outside Austin for the night and leave at first light. Tessa called everyone together once camp was made and did not mince words. "We have 800 miles ahead of us, and we have barely covered 50, she said, her voice hard as iron. "I hired you men to work, not to get drunk and start fights. We are operating on a tight budget and an even tighter schedule. Every delay, every complication, every stupid decision puts this entire operation at risk. From now on, nobody goes into town alone. Nobody drinks more than one beer when we stop to resupply. And if anyone causes trouble that costs this outfit money or time, you will be left behind without pay. Am I clear?" 6 heads nodded, though Tom and Lefty looked like they wanted to sink into the ground. "Good," Tessa said. "Now get some rest. We have a long day tomorrow." As the men dispersed, Graham lingered. "You handled that well," he said. "I should not have to handle it at all," Tessa said, frustration leaking into her voice. "My father never would have had to deal with this kind of nonsense." "Your father probably did," Graham said mildly. "Cowboys are cowboys, and young ones especially are going to make mistakes. The difference is nobody questioned your father's authority, so they were more afraid of disappointing him. You are having to prove yourself every day, which makes it harder." Tessa looked at him sharply. "You think I am not up to this?" "I think you are more than up to it," Graham said, his whiskey-colored eyes serious. "I have ridden for a lot of trail bosses, and you are better than most of them. You know cattle, you know the trail, and you know how to lead. But you are also doing it with one hand tied behind your back, because you are a woman, and these men, whether they admit it or not, are testing you in ways they never would test a man." It was the most Graham had said to her at one time since they had left San Antonio, and Tessa found herself oddly moved by his directness. "So what do I do about it?" "Keep doing exactly what you are doing," Graham said. "Be fair, be firm, and do not give an inch when it comes to the important things. They will come around. Some of them already have." "Have you?" The question slipped out before Tessa could stop it, and she immediately wished she could take it back. Graham smiled, a slow expression that softened the hard lines of his face and made something warm unfurl in Tessa's chest. "Madam, I came around the moment I saw you handling that herd outside San Antonio. I know competence when I see it, and you have got it in spades." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Tessa standing alone by the fire with her heart beating just a little faster than it had been a moment before. They left Austin behind and pushed north through Waco, making good time despite the incident with Tom and Lefty. The two young cowboys worked harder than anyone else, clearly trying to make up for their mistake, and Tessa appreciated the effort even if she did not say so out loud. Red continued to drink, but never so much that it affected his work, and Billy and Frank were proving to be quick learners who were actually starting to be useful rather than just extra bodies, and Graham was becoming indispensable. Tessa found herself consulting with him on decisions large and small, valuing his experience and his level-headed approach to problems. When they hit a swollen river and had to figure out the safest crossing point, Graham rode up and down the bank with her, discussing options and potential dangers. When one of the steers developed an injury that might spread infection through the herd, Graham helped her isolate the animal and treat the wound. When a late spring storm rolled in with lightning and thunder that threatened to stampede the entire herd, Graham was right there beside her, riding through the rain and darkness to keep the cattle calm and contained. Gradually, almost without Tessa noticing it happening, they fell into a partnership that went beyond simple trail boss and hired hand. Graham anticipated what she needed before she asked for it. She trusted him to handle situations without oversight. They developed a shorthand way of communicating, able to convey complex information with just a look or a gesture. The other men started deferring to Graham as second in command, even though Tessa had never officially given him that title, and nobody seemed to question it, including Tessa herself. 3 weeks into the drive, they camped near the Red River, the boundary between Texas and Indian Territory. This was the point of no return. Once they crossed into Indian Territory, they would be committed to the northern route with all its dangers and uncertainties. Tessa stood on the bank looking at the muddy water and feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. "Second thoughts?" Graham asked, appearing beside her with the silent way he had of moving. "1,000 of them," Tessa admitted. "My father always said the Red River crossing was where you found out if you were truly meant to be a trail boss or just playing at it. What do you think you are doing?" Tessa considered the question seriously. "6 months ago, I thought I was just trying to save my father's ranch. But now, I think maybe I am trying to prove something to everyone who said a woman could not do this, to my father's memory, maybe even to myself. And are you proving it?" "I suppose I will find out when we get to Dodge City," Tessa said. "If we get to Dodge City." Graham was quiet for a moment, then said, "For what it is worth, I have already got my answer. You are the real thing, Tessa. Anyone who says otherwise is a fool." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low, steady voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool evening breeze. She turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between respect and something warmer, something that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you probably realize." They stood there for a long moment, the river gurgling past them, and the last light of day painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tessa felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed, and she knew with sudden certainty that this was no longer just a business relationship. Somewhere along the trail between San Antonio and here, between the daily challenges and shared decisions and quiet conversations around the campfire, she had started to care about Graham Irwin as more than just a competent hired hand. The realization should have terrified her. She could not afford distractions, could not let her focus waver from the task at hand. But instead of fear, all Tessa felt was a kind of rightness, as if this was exactly what was supposed to be happening, even if the timing was impossibly complicated. "We should get back to camp," Graham said finally, though he made no move to leave. "Early crossing tomorrow." "Yes," Tessa agreed, but she did not move either. In the end, it was the sound of Red calling for Graham about one of the horses that broke the spell. They walked back to camp separately, maintaining the professional distance that the situation demanded, but Tessa could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. The Red River crossing went smoother than Tessa had dared to hope. The water was high but not dangerously so, and they found a good ford where the bottom was solid enough to support the weight of 2,000 cattle. Graham and Red crossed first to establish the route, Then Tessa led the lead steers into the water. The herd followed reluctantly at first, but once the leaders committed, the rest flowed after them with only minimal encouragement from the cowboys' riding drag. They lost one steer to the current, an older animal that panicked and got swept downstream, but otherwise came through intact. By early afternoon, the entire herd was on the north bank and they were officially in Indian territory. Tessa felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. They had cleared one major hurdle, but they were now entering the most dangerous stretch of the drive. Indian Territory in 1878 was a complicated patchwork of tribal lands, army forts, and lawless areas where outlaws hid from justice. The tribes themselves were dealing with the aftermath of decades of conflict and forced relocation, and while some had adapted to the presence of cattle drives passing through their land, others remained hostile. Tessa had arranged to pay the standard toll to cross Cherokee and Creek territory, but that was no guarantee of safe passage. And beyond the tribal lands, there were always rustlers looking for an easy payday. For the first few days in Indian Territory, everything remained quiet. They pushed the herd north through rolling prairie land with good grass and plenty of water. The weather stayed clear, and the cattle were trail-broke now, moving steadily without the constant urging they had required at the start of the drive. The young cowboys had toughened up, their initial excitement replaced by the steady determination of men who had discovered they could handle hard work. Tessa began to think they might actually pull this off. Then, on the 5th day north of the Red River, red spotted dust on their back trail. At first, Tessa thought it might just be another cattle drive following the same route. But as the day wore on, the dust neither gained on them nor fell back. It maintained a steady distance, as if whoever was making it was deliberately pacing them. "Rustlers," Red said flatly when Tessa consulted with him and Graham that evening. "Nobody else would follow us like that without making their presence known." "How many?" Tessa asked. "Hard to say from the dust," Graham said. "Could be 5 men, could be 20. But the fact that they are staying back suggests they are waiting for the right moment to make their move. Or they are just waiting to see if we have anything worth stealing," Red added. 2,000 head is a tempting target, but it is also a lot of work. They might be hoping we will give them reason to move on and find easier prey. Tessa considered their options. They were at least 2 weeks from the nearest army fort, and even if they could reach it, the soldiers there might not be willing or able to help. Their best bet was to make it clear they were prepared to defend the herd and hope that would be enough to discourage whoever was following them. "Double the night watch," she decided. 2 men on each shift instead of 1, and everyone sleeps with their weapons close. "Graham, you and I will take turns riding perimeter during the day to keep an eye on that dust. If they make a move, I want to know about it before they get close." The next 3 days were tense. The dust remained on their back trail, never getting closer but never falling away either. The men were on edge, jumping at shadows and arguing over small things. Tessa barely slept, pushing herself to exhaustion trying to stay alert for danger while also keeping the herd moving and maintaining some semblance of normal operations. On the 3rd night, Graham found her standing watch alone at 2 in the morning, Billy having fallen asleep at his post. She was about to wake the young cowboy and give him a piece of her mind when Graham stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Let him sleep," Graham said quietly. "I will take his shift. You should get some rest yourself." "I am fine," Tessa said automatically, though the exhaustion in her own voice betrayed her. "No, you are not," Graham said, not unkindly. "You are running yourself into the ground trying to do everything yourself. You have good men working for you, let them do their jobs." "Those men are my responsibility," Tessa said. If something happens to them or this herd because I was not vigilant enough, then it happens, Graham interrupted. Tessa, you cannot control everything. Cattle drives are dangerous. You knew that when you took this on. All you can do is make the best decisions you can with the information you have and trust that the people around you will do their part. But you cannot be everywhere at once, and you cannot stay awake for weeks on end. Tessa wanted to argue, but she was too tired to muster the energy. Instead, she found herself swaying slightly, the exhaustion that she had been holding at bay finally catching up with her. Graham steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch warm even through the fabric of her sleeve. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me walk you back to camp. You need sleep. What about the watch? I will handle it. And before you argue, remember what you said about trusting your people to do their jobs. I have been riding night watch since before you could sit a horse, Tessa Jamison. I think I can manage a few hours keeping an eye on some cattle." There was humor in his voice, but also absolute confidence, and Tessa found herself giving in. She let Graham guide her back to her bedroll, and she was asleep almost before her head hit the saddle she was using as a pillow. She woke 6 hours later to full daylight and the sound of the herd already moving. For a moment, panic seized her. She had overslept. The men had let her oversleep. What if something had happened while she was unconscious? But when she emerged from her bedroll, Red was there with coffee and a plate of biscuits and bacon. "About time," the old cowboy said. "Graham said to let you sleep. He is riding point with the herd. Why did nobody wake me?" Tessa demanded, though she had to admit she felt better than she had in days. "Because you needed sleep more than you needed to prove you could function without it," Red said bluntly. "And before you get all head up about it, Graham asked me to remind you that a good leader knows when to delegate and when to trust her people. He also said if you are still mad after you have had coffee and food, you can yell at him then." Despite herself, Tessa felt a smile tugging at her lips. "He said all that, did he?" "More or less," Red said. "The man has a way with words when he wants to." Tessa drank her coffee and ate her breakfast, then saddled her horse and rode up to the front of the herd where Graham was indeed riding point. He glanced over as she approached, and something in his expression made Tessa's prepared lecture die on her lips. "Thank you," she said instead. "I needed that." "I know," Graham said, "and for what it is worth, nothing happened overnight. The dust is still on our trail, but they have not made a move. I think Red might be right. They are waiting to see if we give them an opening." "Then we will not give them one," Tessa said firmly. That afternoon, the dust finally disappeared. Whether their followers had given up or simply found other prey, Tessa could not say, but the sense of relief that washed over the camp that night was palpable. The men relaxed, laughter returned to the evening campfire, and for the first time in days, Tessa felt like she could breathe properly. She was checking the horses after dinner when Graham appeared beside her. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and then Graham said, "You know, your father would be proud of how you have handled this drive." Tessa's hand stilled on the bridle she was adjusting. "You did not know my father. How would you know what he would think? I know he raised a daughter who is tough enough to take on a job most men would hesitate to attempt, smart enough to adapt when things go wrong, and stubborn enough to keep going when anyone else would quit," Graham said. "Those qualities do not appear out of nowhere. He must have been one hell of a man to produce one hell of a daughter." The simple sincerity in his words broke through the walls Tessa had built around her grief. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "He was," she said, her voice rough. "He was the best man I ever knew." "I am sorry you lost him," Graham said, "but I am not sorry that I got the chance to meet you and see what he helped create." Tessa turned to look at him fully, This man who had become so much more than just a hired hand over the past few weeks. In the fading light, his face was all planes and shadows, but his eyes were steady and warm. "Graham," she said, then hesitated, not sure what she wanted to say. He waited, patient and present, and finally, Tessa just said what was in her heart. "I am glad you are here, not just because you are good at your job, although you are, but because you make this bearable. You make me feel like I am not carrying everything alone." "You are not alone," Graham said, stepping closer. "I know you took on this responsibility by yourself, and I know you have been fighting to prove you can do it without help. But there is no shame in accepting support from people who care about you. And I do care about you, Tessa. More than I probably should, given that you are my employer, and this is supposed to be a professional arrangement." Tessa's heart was hammering in her chest, and she could not seem to look away from his eyes. "I care about you too," she admitted. "I have been trying not to, because this drive has to be my focus and I cannot afford distractions. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being a distraction and started being the best part of my day." Graham reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His calloused fingers were gentle against her cheek, and Tessa found herself leaning into the touch without conscious thought. "I do not want to make things more complicated for you," Graham said quietly. "But I also cannot pretend I do not feel what I feel. You are the strongest, most capable, most fascinating woman I have ever met, and I would like permission to court you properly once this drive is over and you do not have the weight of the world on your shoulders." "Court me," Tessa repeated, and despite everything, she felt a laugh bubble up. "That is very old-fashioned of you." "I am an old-fashioned kind of man," Graham said with a slight grin. "Besides, you deserve to be courted, Tessa Jamison. You deserve flowers and pretty words and someone who sees you for everything you are. And you think you are that someone." "I would like the chance to try," Graham said seriously. "But only if you want that too. I will not push, and I will not make things awkward if you would rather keep this professional." Tessa thought about everything that had happened over the past weeks, the long days on the trail, the challenges they had faced together, the quiet conversations and shared decisions. She thought about how Graham had supported her without undermining her, respected her without coddling her, and made her feel valued in a way that had nothing to do with proving herself and everything to do with simply being herself. "I do want that," she said finally. "But you are right that I need to focus on this drive right now. So here is my counter-proposal. Help me get these cattle to Dodge City and my ranch out of debt. Then, when we are back in Texas with nothing urgent hanging over our heads, you can court me properly. Flowers and pretty words and all of it." Graham's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Deal," he said, and held out his hand. Tessa shook it solemnly, feeling the strength and warmth of his grip, and knew with absolute certainty that she had just made a promise that would change her life in ways that had nothing to do with cattle or ranches or money. They released hands reluctantly, both of them smiling like fools, and returned to their separate tasks. But something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement that what they were building was important and worth protecting. And as Tessa lay in her bedroll that night, staring up at a sky full of stars, she felt something she had not felt in months: hope. Not just for the drive, not just for the ranch, but for herself, and for a future that might include more than just hard work and responsibility. The next few weeks passed in a blur of long days and short nights. They crossed into Kansas and the landscape changed: less trees, more open prairie, endless grass rippling in the wind. The weather turned hot and dry, and the cattle grew thirsty and restless. They pushed hard to reach the Arkansas River, knowing the herd needed water badly, and crossed during a blazing afternoon that left everyone soaked with sweat and river water. But they were making good time, and barring disaster, they would reach Dodge City within a week. The men could feel it, their spirits lifting as the end came into sight. Even the cattle seemed to sense that the endless walking would soon be over, settling into a steady rhythm that required less and less urging from the cowboys. Tessa allowed herself to start thinking about what came next. Selling the herd, paying off the bank, returning home to Texas. And Graham, always Graham, riding beside her or just ahead, a constant presence that had become as essential as air. They talked more as the miles fell away, conversations that ranged from the practical to the personal. Graham told her about growing up on a small ranch in southern Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 17 and striking out on his own to find work. He had spent the last decade moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long in one place, always looking for the next job and the next adventure. Why? Tessa asked one evening as they rode perimeter together. Why not settle down, find a place of your own? Graham was quiet for a moment, then said, I suppose I never found a reason to. It takes more than just land to make a home. It takes people you care about, connections that matter. I never had that after my parents died. So I kept moving because staying in one place just reminded me of what I did not have. And now, Tessa asked softly. Graham turned in his saddle to look at her, his eyes steady and serious. Now I think I might have found a reason to stop moving. The weight of his words hung between them, heavy with implication and promise. Tessa felt her breath catch, felt the full force of what he was offering, not just courtship, not just romance, but a future, a partnership, a home. I would like that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would like that very much. They were 5 days from Dodge City when the summer storm hit. Tessa had been watching the clouds build all afternoon, great towering thunderheads that turned the sky the color of old bruises. She ordered the men to push the herd harder, hoping to find shelter before the storm broke, but they were in open prairie with nowhere to take cover. The first drops fell just before sunset, fat and heavy. Then the wind picked up, and suddenly the rain was coming down in sheets so thick Tessa could barely see 10 feet in front of her. Lightning split the sky, and the thunder that followed was so loud it felt like the earth itself was splitting apart. The cattle panicked. 2,000 longhorns broke and ran, stampeding blindly into the storm-darkened prairie. Tessa screamed orders that were torn away by the wind, her horse plunging and rearing beneath her as she fought to keep her seat. She caught glimpses of the other riders read somewhere to her left, Billy or maybe Frank behind her, but everything was chaos and noise and terror. Then Graham was there, appearing out of the rain like a ghost, his horse pressed close to hers. He shouted something she could not hear over the thunder, but she understood the gesture, follow me. She gave her horse its head and let it run alongside Graham's mount, trusting him to know what he was doing even though she could see nothing in the storm-tossed darkness. They rode hard for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, chasing the stampeding herd and trying to turn the leaders. It was the most dangerous thing a cowboy could do, get in front of a stampede and try to redirect it, but it was the only way to stop the cattle before they ran themselves to death, or scattered so far they could never be gathered again. Gradually, impossibly, the lead steers began to turn. Graham and Tessa rode alongside them, forcing them into a curve that would eventually bring them back on themselves and create a mill, the cattle running in a circle rather than a straight line. Once the mill formed, the momentum would bleed off and the herd would slow, then stop. Tessa's horse stumbled, nearly throwing her, and she felt a spike of pure terror. Falling in front of a stampede meant death, crushed under thousands of hooves with no chance of escape. But the horse caught itself and ran on, and then other riders were there, Red and Frank and Billy, all working together to keep the leaders turning. The mill formed. The cattle began to slow, and finally, blessedly, they stopped, heaving and snorting and milling in confusion but no longer running. The rain continued to fall, but the worst of the storm had passed, the lightning moving off to the east. Tessa sat on her trembling horse, rain streaming down her face, and did a quick head count. Red, Frank, Billy, Tom, Graham, only 5 men. Lefty was missing. "Where is Lefty?" she shouted, her voice hoarse. The men looked at each other, and she saw her own fear reflected in their faces. Graham wheeled his horse and rode back the way they had come, disappearing into the darkness. Tessa wanted to follow, but she needed to stay with the herd, to make sure it did not break again. So she waited, counting seconds that felt like hours, until Graham reappeared with Lefty's horse in tow. But no Lefty. Graham's face told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "I found his horse a quarter-mile back. He must have been thrown during the stampede. I searched as much as I could in the dark, but—" "We will find him at first light," Tessa said, her heart like lead in her chest. "Right now, we need to keep this herd calm and make sure we do not lose anyone else." It was the longest night of Tessa's life. They stood watch over the cattle in shifts, everyone exhausted and grieving and terrified. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, Tessa organized a search party. Graham, Red, and Frank rode back along the stampede trail while Tessa stayed with the herd and the remaining men. They found Lefty 2 hours later. He was alive, barely, with a broken leg and several cracked ribs and a gash on his head that was still bleeding sluggishly. He had been lucky he had fallen at the edge of the stampede rather than directly in front of it, and somehow most of the herd had missed him. But he was in no condition to ride, and they were still 5 days from Dodge City with no way to get him proper medical care. Tessa made the only decision she could. They would push on to Dodge City as fast as possible, with Lefty carried in the supply wagon on a bed of blankets. It would be agonizing for him, but it was better than leaving him behind or trying to find help in the middle of nowhere. The next 5 days were a nightmare. Lefty drifted in and out of consciousness, fevered and in obvious pain despite the laudanum they gave him from the medical kit. The rest of the men were subdued. The reality of how dangerous their work was hitting them hard. Even the cattle seemed affected, moving listlessly as if they could sense the pall that had fallen over the drive. But they kept moving, mile after grinding mile, because there was nothing else to do. Graham rode beside the supply wagon whenever he could, checking on Lefty and offering quiet words of encouragement that Tessa was not sure the injured man could even hear. Red took on extra watch shifts without being asked, and the other young cowboys stepped up to handle tasks they had always relied on more experienced hands to manage. And Tessa pushed herself harder than ever, riding point and drag and flank, checking the cattle, monitoring their water supply, planning the route, making 1,000 decisions a day while trying to ignore the guilt eating at her insides. Lefty had been hurt on her watch, during a drive she had insisted on leading. If he died, it would be her fault. Graham found her on the 4th night after the stampede, sitting alone away from the campfire and staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without speaking, and for a long time they just existed in shared silence. Finally, Tessa said, "I should have seen that storm coming earlier. Should have found shelter, or at least had the men better prepared for a stampede. This is my responsibility." "This is the nature of the work," Graham said quietly. "Cattle drives are dangerous. You know that. Your father knew that. Every man who signed on for this drive knew that. Lefty is hurt, and that is terrible, but it is not your fault." "How is it not my fault?" Tessa demanded, her voice breaking. "I am the trail boss. Everything that happens is my fault. By that logic, every cowboy who ever got hurt or killed on a cattle drive is the fault of whoever was leading," Graham said. "Do you really think that is true? Or do you think maybe sometimes bad things happen despite everyone doing their best?" Tessa wanted to argue, but she could not find the words. She was so tired of being strong, tired of being responsible, tired of carrying everything alone. "I do not know if I can do this," she whispered. "I do not know if I am strong enough." Graham turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said fiercely. "You have brought this herd over 700 miles through storms and threats and 100 other challenges. You have kept these men alive and moving forward even when everything seemed impossible. You have done what your father built a lifetime of experience to do, and you have done it on your first drive. If that is not strength, I do not know what is." "But Lefty signed on knowing the risks, just like the rest of us," Graham said. "And he is going to be fine, because you made the right call to push for Dodge City instead of trying to find help out here. You saved his life, Tessa. You did not endanger it." Tessa closed her eyes, letting the warmth of Graham's hands anchor her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that she had done everything she could. And slowly, she realized that he was right. Bad things happened. People got hurt. But she had made the best decisions she could with the information she had, and she had adapted when things went wrong. That was all anyone could do. "Thank you," she said, opening her eyes to meet his steady gaze. "Thank you for being here, for believing in me even when I do not believe in myself." "Always," Graham said simply, and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that Tessa felt her heart turn over in her chest. They reached Dodge City on a blazing afternoon in early July, 2 months to the day after leaving San Antonio. The town sprawled across the Kansas prairie like a promise: wooden buildings, dusty streets, and the railroad tracks that would carry their cattle east to market. Tessa had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. They herded the cattle into the stockyards, and Lefty was immediately taken to the doctor's office, where a tired-looking physician declared that he would recover fully, but needed several weeks of bed rest. Tessa paid for a room at the boarding house and left money for his care, promising to come back for him once her business in Dodge City was concluded. Then came the sale. Tessa met with cattle buyers in a cramped office that smelled of cigar smoke and whiskey, negotiating prices with men who clearly thought they could take advantage of a young woman who did not know what she was doing. But Tessa had been watching her father haggle with buyers her entire life, and she knew exactly what her cattle were worth. She held firm on her price, refusing to budge even when the buyers claimed she was being unreasonable. Finally, after 2 days of tense negotiation, she reached an agreement. The price was not quite as high as she had hoped, but it was fair, and it would be enough to pay off the bank loan and leave a small cushion for operating expenses. The buyer arranged for payment to be transferred to her bank in San Antonio, and just like that, it was done. The drive was over. The ranch was saved. Tessa walked out of that office feeling like she was floating. Behind her, Graham was waiting with Red and the other men, and when they saw her face, they broke into cheers. She had done it. Against all odds, despite every challenge and complication, she had gotten 2,000 head of cattle from San Antonio to Dodge City and sold them at a fair price. The ranch was safe. Her father's legacy was secure. That night, she treated all the men to a proper meal at the best restaurant in Dodge City, which admittedly was not saying much, but was still far better than what they had been eating on the trail. They drank beer and ate steak and potatoes, and the young cowboys got progressively louder and more boisterous as the evening wore on. Red got pleasantly drunk and started telling improbable stories about cattle drives from decades past. Even Graham, usually so reserved, smiled and laughed and looked more relaxed than Tessa had ever seen him. "What are you going to do now?" Red asked Tessa as the evening wound down. "Head back to Texas, eventually," Tessa said. "First, I need to make sure Lefty is taken care of and arrange for supplies for the trip home. Then yes, back to Texas, back to the ranch." "You are going to keep running it?" Billy asked. "Of course," Tessa said, surprised by the question. "That was the whole point of this drive." "But now people know you can do it," Tom said. "You could probably find work as a trail boss for other outfits, make real money instead of just keeping a ranch afloat." Tessa considered the idea, but only for a moment. "The ranch is my home," she said simply. "It is my family's legacy. I did not do this so I could leave, I did it so I could stay." She caught Graham watching her with an expression of such warmth and approval that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Later, after the other men had wandered off to find entertainment elsewhere in town, Graham walked her back to the boarding house where she was staying. "So," he said as they stood on the porch under a sky full of stars, "we made it. You got your herd to market and saved your ranch. Which means I can officially start that courtship we talked about." Tessa laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "You certainly can. Although I should warn you, I am not much for sitting around being courted. I have a ranch to run." "Good thing I am not much for sitting around either," Graham said. "I was thinking maybe I could ride back to Texas with you, see this ranch I have heard so much about. Maybe stick around and help with the day-to-day operations if you need an experienced hand." Tessa's breath caught. "You would do that? Give up drifting from job to settle down on a ranch in Texas?" "I told you back on the trail I think I found my reason to stop moving," Graham said, his voice low and serious. "You are that reason, Tessa. This drive, these past 2 months, showed me what I have been missing all these years. Not just a place, but a person. Someone to build something with. If you will have me, I would like to stay. Not just for a season or a year, but for good." Tessa felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that more than anything." Graham stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek the way it had that night on the prairie. "Tessa Jamison," he said softly, "you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. I fell for you somewhere between San Antonio and here, and I do not think I will ever stop falling. So if you are amenable, I would like to kiss you now, and then I would like to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in letting me into your life." "I think I am amenable to that," Tessa whispered, and then his lips were on hers, warm and firm and perfect. The kiss was everything Tessa had imagined and more gentle at first, then deepening as Graham pulled her closer and she wrapped her arms around his neck. He tasted like beer and possibility, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard and smiling like idiots. "So," Graham said, resting his forehead against hers, "tomorrow we start the trip back to Texas, and then I get to see what I am getting myself into with this ranch of yours. You might regret it," Tessa warned. "It is a lot of work, and the profit margins are thin, and there is always something breaking down or going wrong." "Sounds perfect," Graham said, and kissed her again. They left Dodge City 3 days later, once Lefty was settled and recovering well and the men had been paid their wages. Red decided to stay in Kansas, declaring that he was too old for any more cattle drives and was going to find a nice saloon where he could drink in peace. The 4 young cowboys were hired by another outfit heading to Montana, eager for more adventure now that they had proven themselves on the trail. That left Tessa and Graham to make the long ride back to Texas alone, which suited Tessa just fine. They took their time, following the trail south at a leisurely pace with no cattle to push and no pressing deadlines to meet. They camped under the stars and talked for hours about everything and nothing: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Graham proved to be a man of his word in every way. He treated Tessa with respect and affection, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that he was completely devoted to her. He insisted on handling the heavy work when they made camp each night. He brought her wildflowers he picked along the trail. He told her stories that made her laugh and listened with genuine interest when she talked about the ranch and her plans for its future. By the time they crossed back into Texas 3 weeks later, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this man. It was not just attraction, though she certainly felt that. It was not just gratitude for his help on the drive, though she was deeply grateful. It was the bone-deep recognition that she had found someone who saw her clearly, all her strengths and flaws and complications, and loved her not despite them, but because of them. The ranch looked exactly as she had left it, a sprawling collection of buildings and corrals nestled in a valley with good grass and a year-round creek. Tessa felt emotion swell in her chest as they rode up the dusty track to the main house. She had done it. She had saved this place. And now she was coming home with someone who would help her build it into something even better than it had been. Over the next few months, they fell into a rhythm. Graham proved to be as skilled at ranch work as he had been on the trail, and together they began making improvements that Tessa had been dreaming about for years. They repaired fences, rebuilt the barn that had been falling apart, and started a breeding program to improve the quality of their cattle. Graham had ideas and experience from all the ranches he had worked, and Tessa had intimate knowledge of this specific land and its quirks. Combined, they made a formidable team. They also made time for courtship, proper and improper. Graham took Tessa to town for dances and dinners, always the perfect gentleman. But he also pulled her into the barn for stolen kisses when they were supposed to be working, made her laugh until her sides hurt with his dry observations about ranch life, and showed her in 100 ways that he was planning to be part of her life forever. 6 months after they returned from Dodge City, on a cool December evening with the first hints of winter in the air, Graham took Tessa out to the hillside where her parents were buried. They stood together looking at the headstones, and Graham said quietly, "I wish I could have met them. Your father especially. I would have liked to tell him that I intend to spend the rest of my life taking care of his daughter and honoring what he built here." "He would have liked you," Tessa said softly. "He always respected competence and integrity, and you have both in spades." Graham turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Tessa Jamison, I know we have only known each other for 8 months, but they have been the best 8 months of my life. You have shown me what it means to have a home, a purpose, and a future worth fighting for. I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day. Will you marry me?" Tessa felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide it almost hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Graham Irwin, I will marry you. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes, but I also cannot imagine my life without you in it." Graham pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, nothing fancy, but clearly chosen with care, and slipped it onto her finger. Then he kissed her there on the hillside under the vast Texas sky, and Tessa felt like her heart would burst with happiness. They were married in town 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony with just a few neighbors as witnesses. Tessa wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk in the attic, and Graham wore a new suit that made him look both uncomfortable and heartbreakingly handsome. They said their vows before a circuit preacher who rode through the area once a month, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, learning to share space and decisions and life with another person. But it was also the happiest year Tessa had ever known. Graham was everything she had hoped for and more, a true partner who valued her opinions, respected her abilities, and loved her fiercely. They worked the ranch together during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, building a life that was richer and fuller than anything Tessa could have imagined. In the spring of 1879, Tessa discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had lost her own mother in childbirth, and the fear that history might repeat itself haunted her dark moments. But Graham was there, steady and strong, holding her when she cried and reassuring her that everything would be fine. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Tessa's father, was born in January of 1880 on a cold, clear morning. The birth was long and difficult, but both mother and baby came through it safely. Tessa cried when the midwife placed the squirming, red-faced infant in her arms, overwhelmed by love and relief and the sheer wonder of this tiny person they had created. Graham was equally besotted, spending hours just watching Samuel sleep and insisting on helping with all the care that many men would have considered women's work. He changed diapers and walked the floor with a colicky baby in the middle of the night and sang terrible off-key lullabies that somehow always made Samuel stop crying. "You are going to spoil him," Tessa said one evening, watching Graham rock their son with infinite patience. "Good," Graham said unapologetically. "Every child should be spoiled with love. There will be plenty of time for him to learn about hard work and responsibility. Right now, he just needs to know he is safe and wanted and cherished." Tessa fell in love with her husband all over again in that moment, seeing the kind of father he would be: present, engaged, loving. This was the future she had fought so hard to preserve, and it was even better than she had dreamed. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Emma, who had Tessa's auburn hair and Graham's whiskey-colored eyes. And 3 years after that, another son, William, who was quieter than his siblings but had a way of observing everything with an intensity that reminded Tessa of her father. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and developed a reputation for producing quality cattle. Other ranchers started coming to them for advice, and Graham's name became as respected in Texas ranching circles as Tessa's father's had been. But success was not measured only in cattle and money. It was measured in the sound of children's laughter echoing through the ranch house. It was measured in stolen moments between Tessa and Graham, still finding each other irresistible after years of marriage. It was measured in friendships with neighbors, in the respect of the community, in the satisfaction of building something lasting and good. In the summer of 1887, 9 years after that fateful cattle drive, Tessa stood on the porch of the ranch house and surveyed her domain. The children were playing in the yard. Samuel, now 7, teaching his younger siblings how to rope a fence post. Graham was working with the horses in the corral, his movements as graceful and competent as they had been the day she met him. The ranch was thriving, the cattle healthy, the buildings well maintained. Graham finished with the horses and walked over to join her on the porch, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we have come," Tessa said. 9 years ago, I was so scared and so determined to prove I could do everything myself. I thought accepting help was weakness. And now I know that the strongest thing I ever did was let you into my life," Tessa said, turning to look up at him. "I could have saved the ranch on my own, maybe, but I could not have built this family, this partnership, this life without you. You made everything better just by being part of it." Graham kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become as familiar and comfortable as breathing. "I was just a cowboy tipping his hat and following your lead," he said with a hint of his old humor. "You were always the one riding harder than anyone else, showing everyone what was possible." "We make a good team," Tessa said. "The best," Graham agreed. They stood together watching their children play, surrounded by the land they had fought to keep and the life they had built together. Tessa thought about that young woman who had stood in a San Antonio hiring yard, desperate and determined and so very alone. She thought about the long, hard trail to Dodge City and all the challenges they had overcome. She thought about the moment Graham Irwin had walked into her life and changed everything. It had not been easy. It had not been simple. But it had been worth every difficult moment, every sleepless night, every fear and doubt and struggle. Because at the end of it all, she had found not just success but happiness, not just survival but joy, not just a saved ranch but a home filled with love. "I love you," she said to Graham, the words as true now as they had been the first time she said them. "I love you too," Graham replied, and kissed her properly, long and slow and sweet, while their children giggled and made exaggerated gagging sounds in the yard. Tessa laughed against his lips, feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. This was the future she had fought for on that cattle drive, not just the land or the legacy, but this moment right here. This family, this love, this life. Years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Samuel grew into a serious young man who loved the ranch with the same fierce devotion his mother and grandfather had shown. Emma proved to have her mother's determination and her father's steady competence, equally comfortable working cattle or managing the household accounts. William, the quiet observer, surprised everyone by showing a talent for training horses that eventually brought additional income to the ranch. Tessa and Graham grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard physical work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming a foundation so solid that everything else in their lives could be built upon it. They still found each other attractive, still stole kisses in the barn when they thought nobody was looking, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. In the winter of 1895, Tessa received a letter from Lefty, the young cowboy who had been injured during the stampede all those years ago. He had recovered fully and gone on to have a successful career as a ranch foreman, eventually marrying and starting his own small outfit in Montana. He wrote to thank Tessa for saving his life by pushing the herd to Dodge City, and to tell her that he often shared the story of the cattle drive boss who rode harder than any man on the trail, showing anyone who would listen that capability and leadership had nothing to do with gender. Tessa showed the letter to Graham, and they sat together on the porch reading it, both of them moved by the knowledge that their story had become part of the legend and lore of the Old West. Children and grandchildren of people who had known them told stories about the woman who had saved her father's ranch against all odds and the cowboy who had been smart enough to follow her lead. But for Tessa and Graham, it was never about becoming legends. It was always about the simple, profound act of building a life together. It was about morning coffee on the porch and evening rides to check the herd. It was about teaching their children the value of hard work and honest dealing. It was about holding each other through the hard times and celebrating together during the good times. It was about love, in all its complicated, beautiful, messy glory. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned, Tessa and Graham celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. Their children were grown, Samuel preparing to take over full management of the ranch, Emma married to a neighboring rancher's son and expecting her first child, William establishing himself as the premier horse trainer in the region. That evening, after a family dinner full of laughter and stories, Tessa and Graham took a walk to the hillside where her parents were buried, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. They stood hand in hand looking at the simple headstones, now weathered by 2 decades of sun and rain. "You think they know?" Tessa asked quietly. "How well everything turned out?" "I think if there is any justice in the universe they do," Graham said. "You honored everything they built, Tessa. You took what they started and made it bigger and better and more enduring. They would be proud beyond measure." "We made it bigger and better," Tessa corrected. "This was never just me, Graham. This was always us." Graham squeezed her hand. "I still remember the first time I saw you, cracking that whip and giving orders like you had been born to it. I thought you were the most magnificent thing I had ever seen, and I was not wrong." Tessa laughed. "You also thought I was crazy for attempting that drive with only 5 inexperienced men." "Well, you were a little crazy," Graham admitted with a grin. "But it was the good kind of crazy, the kind that changes the world." They walked back to the ranch house as twilight fell, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The house glowed with lamplight, and through the windows they could see their children and grandchild-to-be, their legacy stretching into a future they had fought so hard to secure. "No regrets?" Graham asked as they stood on the porch, the question he had asked her 100 times over the years. "Not a single one," Tessa replied, as she always did. "You?" "Only that I did not find you sooner," Graham said, pulling her close. "But I guess some things are worth waiting for." They kissed there on the porch of the ranch house. 2 people who had built something extraordinary out of determination, hard work, and a love that had proven stronger than any challenge they faced. The cattle drive that had brought them together was long past, but its lessons remained: trust your abilities, accept help when it is offered, ride hard toward your goals, and never underestimate the power of 2 people working together toward a common purpose. Inside the house, their family waited. Behind them, the ranch spread across the Texas landscape, thriving and prosperous. Above them, the stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched over them during that long-ago drive to Dodge City. Tessa Jamison Irwin had set out to save a ranch and had found so much more: partnership, family, love, and a life rich with meaning and joy. Graham Irwin had been drifting from job to job, looking for something he could not name, until he found it in a fierce young woman who needed experienced hands and offered him a home in return. Together, they had written a story that would be told for generations: the cattle drive boss who rode harder than any man on the trail, and the cowboy who tipped his hat and followed her lead, right into a future neither of them could have imagined but both of them helped create. As they stood together on the porch watching the sunset, surrounded by everything they had built, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment, every challenge overcome, every sacrifice made had been worth it. Because at the end of the journey, she had found not just success but happiness, not just survival but a life filled with love and purpose and joy. And really, what more could anyone ask for than that? The stars continued to emerge, one by one, each one a point of light in the gathering darkness. And Tessa and Graham stood together, hand in hand, facing whatever the future might bring with the confidence that came from years of facing challenges together and emerging stronger for it. Their story was complete, every thread woven together into a tapestry that showed the full richness of a life well lived and a love well earned. From that dusty hiring yard in San Antonio to this peaceful evening on their Texas ranch, they had traveled far and faced much. But they had done it together, and that had made all the difference. The house waited, warm and welcoming. Their family waited inside, ready to hear more stories of the old days. The ranch waited, ready for another day of work and care and attention. And Tessa and Graham waited too, but not for anything specific. They were simply present, in that perfect moment, grateful for every step of the journey that had brought them here. As they finally turned to go inside, Graham paused and looked back at the land spread before them, silver and shadow in the growing darkness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Tessa asked. "For taking a chance on a drifting cowboy who showed up late looking for work," Graham said. "For letting me be part of this, for building a life with me, for everything." Tessa smiled, the expression lighting her face despite the years that had passed since that long-ago cattle drive. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "For respecting what I was trying to do and supporting it instead of trying to take over. For loving me not despite my independence, but because of it. For being exactly what I needed exactly when I needed it." "Always," Graham promised, echoing the word he had spoken that night on the trail when she had first admitted she cared for him. "Always and forever." They went inside together, closing the door on the night and opening it on the warmth and light and love that filled their home. Outside, the ranch settled into its evening rhythms, cattle lowing softly, horses shifting in their stalls, the land itself seeming to breathe in the cool night air. It was a good life. Hard won, carefully built, deeply cherished. And as Tessa and Graham sat down to spend the evening with their family, sharing stories and laughter and the simple joy of being together, they knew without question that they had succeeded in the only way that truly mattered. They had found each other. They had built something lasting. They had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And they had done it all with love, respect, and a partnership that had proven stronger than any obstacle placed in their path. The cattle drive boss had ridden hard and true, proving that strength and capability knew no gender. The cowboy had tipped his hat and followed her lead, wise enough to recognize quality when he saw it and brave enough to commit to it fully. Together, they had written a love story for the ages, one that proved the Old West had room for new ideas and that the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect and genuine affection. As the new century stretched before them, full of possibilities and promise, Tessa and Graham faced it together as they had faced everything else side by side, hand in hand, hearts united in purpose and love. Their story was complete, but their life together continued, each day a new chapter in a book that had proven to be far richer and more rewarding than either of them could have imagined when they first met in that San Antonio hiring yard all those years ago. And in the end, that was the greatest success of all, not just the saved ranch or the thriving business or the respected name, but the love that had grown and deepened over decades, remaining constant through every change and challenge. That was the real legacy, the one that mattered most. Love, partnership, family, and a life built together with care and intention and unwavering commitment. The stars shone on, watching over the ranch and the people within it, just as they had watched over a cattle drive 2 decades earlier when two people had found each other against all odds. And somewhere in that vast Texas night, the spirits of those who had come before seemed to smile, satisfied that their legacy was in good hands and their sacrifices had borne fruit beyond anything they could have imagined. All was well. All was right. And the story, finally, was complete.